Now, just to apply this a little bit to the contemporary Middle East, it seems to me that, in my view, Tunisia and Egypt, of all of those countries, really have the best chance of making this transition. Perhaps the most important in both cases is that of all of the countries in the region, they probably have the best developed national identities and histories as states, particularly Egypt, whose history of stateness goes back several millennia. And so therefore, they do not have the same kinds of problems of national cohesion that some of the other countries in that region have. The big problem is, as I said, lack of organization. In Egypt, for example, the two best organized social forces in that country are the army and the Muslim Brotherhood, even though those two organizations may not represent anything like a majority of the Egyptian people, which is why having later elections to allow the more democratic forces time to organize probably would have been a good thing. In other countries, in Libya, in Yemen, in Syria, Jordan, Bahrain, the situation, I think, is much more complicated because these countries, in a sense, are much weaker in terms of national cohesion and identity than either Tunisia or Egypt. They're divided by tribal loyalties, by religion, by sect, by ethnicity, and therefore many of the conflicts are not simply conflicts between democracy and autocracy. They represent conflicts over other issues in which the building of a national identity is going to have to occur simultaneously with any effort to democratize those societies, and will lead to a redistribution of power between the different contending groups and the like. One of the biggest pitfalls of new democracies is the problem of corruption. If a new democracy behaves in a corrupt manner, there's nothing better suited to undermining its legitimacy in the short run. And in some sense, it is not an accident that you get a lot of corruption, A, in poor countries, and B, in countries that are new to democracy, because you need to mobilize people, and one of the easiest ways to mobilize people is through patronage, or simply paying them to support you. This was something I think that over time we learned to overcome. Europe and the United States both had this kind of politics. The United States, in fact, had very corrupt municipal government well into the 20th century, so I don't think we're in a position to lecture anybody, but it is a very important pitfall of any new country that's made a transition to a more open form of politics. All right. So that is my view of what is going on in the Middle East. I would say, as a political analyst, I've never seen a situation, in a sense, that has as much equal measure of danger and promise as this region. It is perfectly possible to imagine extremely positive outcomes as a result of this democratic transition and this part of the world joining the rest of the democratic world. But it is also possible to imagine very bad outcomes. And it is possible to imagine both of them happening at the same time, because the way that some countries go may be completely different from others. And the world system isn't very good at managing multiple crises happening simultaneously. And so we will have to wait and see. All right. So I actually want to now move on beyond the Middle East, because after September 11th, a lot of people began to argue in opposition to what I had been, the line that I had been arguing since for the past 20 years, that liberal democracy was in a way the default form of government. A lot of people said, well, it could be an Islamic republic or something of that sort. I think that's just nonsense. I don't think it was ever in the cards for anybody that didn't start out culturally Muslim, and even in the Muslim world, as I said, I don't think it was an important trend. But there is one country or one political system that is, I think, a serious alternative to Western liberal democracy, and that is the model that is posed by China. And so I think it behooves us to think a little bit about what the Chinese model is, what its advantages and weaknesses are, and how it compares to existing democracies like the United States, Portugal, other parts of the European Union. I think that, and again, this is an issue that I deal with at much greater length in my new book, where I have quite a number of chapters on the formation of the Chinese state. I believe that China actually was the first society in the world not to develop a state per se, but to develop a modern state, meaning a state that was not based on friends and family, hiring your cousin or your brother-in-law to run the government, but to actually create a civil service examination, to hire civil servants on a rational basis, to educate them, and then to administer an enormous empire in a centralized and extremely rational way. And the Chinese did this in the 3rd century BC. They achieved this kind of bureaucratic centralization 1,800 years before any European achieved this kind of modern political state. And I think that this is an achievement that the Chinese have never, in Western circles, have never gotten adequate credit for. They were then able to maintain this form of bureaucratic centralization over the years, over the next, 23 centuries. And I think that that is still the characteristic of Chinese government. Now, it differs very dramatically from the form of government that arose in the West, which I think is peculiar in certain respects. In the West, you started with the rule of law, which the Chinese never had, largely because China never had any form of transcendental organized religion separate from the state, unlike Christianity in the Western experience, and the Catholic Church as an institution that could limit the power of European princes. So Europe started with the rule of law. When it tried to create a Chinese-style state in the 16th and 17th centuries, it was never able to concentrate power because people had legal protections in a way that they never had in China. And then at the end of this process, you have this almost accidental rise of parliamentary democracy because of the survival of a feudal institution, the English Parliament, into modern times that was able to check the power of the English king and force a constitutional settlement in the late 17th century that is the basis for modern constitutional government. The Glorious Revolution represented the first moment at which a monarch conceded the principle that legitimate rule comes from the consent of the people and that there should be no taxation without representation. And so in Europe, you had rule of law first, then a centralized state, and then representative government. In China, you began with a centralized state that was so powerful that it then could block the formation of challengers to its own rule. And so the contrast is really between a high-quality authoritarian centralized state and one that has multiple checks and balances through rule of law and through democratic accountability. So in the Chinese model, the contemporary Chinese model, we have the following characteristics. The Chinese form of authoritarianism is very high quality compared to Africa, the Middle East, virtually any other part of the world, coming out of this long-term Confucian tradition in that part of East Asia. It's no accident that the most successful authoritarian modernizers, South Korea, Japan at one period of its history, Taiwan, Singapore, they're all within the Chinese cultural sphere, and they are all heritors of this tradition of bureaucratic, strong bureaucratic government. But in the current manifestation, it's kind of remarkable that the Chinese government actually mimics the accountability of a democratic system because they monitor things. They don't respond simply by intimidation and repression. A lot of times if they see complaints, and there's a lot of complaints in China, they respond by actually appeasing and trying to fix problems before they turn into intractable social conflicts. For example, China Gini coefficient, the measure that economists use of inequality, has increased enormously over the last 20 years. The coastal provinces have gotten much, much richer than the interior, which has been left behind. Unlike a democratic country, and by the way, their levels of inequality are now up to Latin American levels. Now, in Latin America, when you try to fix this problem, you get a lot of opposition from entrenched groups. The rich don't want to pay taxes. People don't want to redistribute income. In China, because you've got an authoritarian system, you can actually shift investment from the coastal provinces to the more impoverished interior ones more readily than you can in a democratic system. And so there is a kind of ability to force from above a certain degree of what I would actually call genuine accountability in that system. They have term limits. The Communist Party in China is very well institutionalized. One of the big problems in the Middle East and in Africa has been leaders who simply overstay their leave. Gaddafi has been around for 40 years, Mubarak for 30, Ben Ali for more than 20. The Chinese know when to step down. They vet their leaders very carefully. There's a highly institutionalized system of leadership rotation. So in all these respects, the quality of their authoritarianism leaves all of the other ones in the dust. Right. The second component of this model is a strong export orientation. In this respect, they're really not different from Korea, Japan, Singapore, Taiwan, a lot of other countries in East Asia. They have used exports and integration into the global economy as a source of their rapid growth, involving considerable government assistance to their exporters, in China's case particularly in the form of an undervalued renminbi. The third characteristic that's part of the Chinese model is a modified industrial policy. I lived in Washington, D.C. for 20 years. Part of the Washington consensus was a complete rejection of industrial policy. That is to say, the government actually trying to help certain strategic sectors through investment. The Chinese don't do it in quite the way that the Japanese and the Koreans did, but clearly their ability to create infrastructure, to overcome bottlenecks, to promote certain strategic sectors is enormous, and it's very different from the Anglo-Saxon laissez-faire model that has prevailed in the United States and in countries influenced by the U.S. Fourth characteristic of their model is a relatively meager social safety net when compared to Scandinavia or indeed much of continental Europe. That may be changing at the moment, but right now most Chinese citizens are they're given employment rather than welfare benefits, which I would say actually is one of the reasons that they've been growing a lot faster than other countries that get that mixture backwards. All right, so first of all, let's begin with the question, will the Chinese regime become unstable? I don't believe so, because of this high-quality authoritarianism. They've created so many jobs, and people still remember what it was like, what life was like under Maoism a generation ago, that I don't perceive any strong impulse. There's certainly indignity to individual dignity that occurs all the time in China, but right now that is compensated for by the quality of the government that provides this kind of economic growth. And so I don't expect at all a short-term spread of the Jasmine Revolution to China. What are some of the advantages and disadvantages of this system when compared to a democratic one? If you compare China and India, the classic comparison between the two lies in infrastructure. The Chinese, if you've been to China recently, have beautiful airports, high-speed rail. They put in, they've got something on the order of 5 times the stored water in China that they do in India, despite the fact that China is a drier country overall. They create something like the Three Gorges Dam that requires moving 1.2 million people out of the floodplain. And they can do this all very rapidly because they are an authoritarian regime that does not have to listen to the complaints of its own people. India, by contrast, is a law-governed democracy When the Tata Motor Company tried to build a plant in West Bengal a couple of years ago, they were hit with lawsuits, strikes, trade union objections, peasants' associations, and the like, and they finally gave up. And that is one of the reasons that Indian infrastructure compared to that of China is in such ill repair. So that kind of authoritarian government, in terms of macroeconomic policy making, actually has a number of advantages over a comparable law-governed democracy. I would say, as an American, our system isn't doing very well either. We don't have high-speed rail in the United States. And in fact, we have not made any moves towards repairing our own long-term fiscal sustainability problem because of gridlock and checks and balances in Washington, D.C. And so we suffer in certain respects from exactly the same problems that the Indians do.